The first thing I heard that Tuesday morning wasn't the cheerful chirping of the sparrows nesting in my willow tree or the gentle splash of the koi in my pond. It was the sound of a human pterodactyl screeching my name. Leo, I have a pond. It's not the Atlantic Ocean. It's a modest, kidney-shaped thing I dug myself, a peaceful oasis at the edge of my 2-acre property. To Beverly Higgins, the self-appointed queen of the Hesperides Grove Homeowners Association, it was an eyesore, a mosquito breeding cesspool, and a clear violation of some bylaw she'd probably invented over her morning mimosa. I watched from my kitchen window as she marched up my driveway, a whirlwind of designer athleisure wear and righteous indignation, her face set in a grimace that could curdle milk. Leo, she shrieked again, her voice cutting through the calm. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark roast. The day of reckoning had arrived, and frankly, I was ready for it. You see, while Beverly was complaining about my pond, I'd been quietly buying up the debt on her McMansion, and I had a very specific, very satisfying plan for her backyard. Beverly's knocks on my front door were less like a request for entry and more like a police raid. I opened it with a calmness I knew would infuriate her further. Leo, she began, not even bothering with a greeting, that pond is an absolute disgrace. It's a health hazard. I saw a frog, Leo. In nature, I said, leaning against the doorframe. It happens. Do not take that tone with me, she spat, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger in my direction. The HOA bylaws clearly state that any body of water exceeding 100 gallons requires prior written approval from the Architectural Committee. My pond, a lovingly crafted ecosystem with a liner, a pump, and a small waterfall, held about 1,500 gallons. I knew this. She knew this. The committee, which consisted of Beverly, her husband Carl, and their poodle, Mr. Snuggles, had not approved it. I applied for approval. Beverly, I reminded her patiently, you denied it on the grounds that it, and I believe I have the email right here, would attract quote-unquote undesirable waterfowl. She crossed her arms. And has it? Well, I saw a very nice family of ducks last week, I said. They didn't leave a mess. They were very polite. This is not a joke, Leo. This is about property values. Your little swamp is dragging down the entire neighborhood. I looked past her, across the immaculate, chemically green lawns of Hesperides Grove, each house a perfect replica of the next, each shrub trimmed into obedient submission. My property, with its wildflowers, its vegetable garden, and yes, my beautiful pond, was an island of rebellion. I liked it that way. The confrontation ended, as they always did, with Beverly threatening legal action, fines, and the wrath of the entire HOA board. I nodded, offered her a muffin which she refused with a look of horror, and closed the door. The peace was shattered, but my resolve was hardened. This had been going on for 2 years, ever since I'd inherited this property from my eccentric Uncle Frank. Uncle Frank, a man who believed grass was for cows, not for people, had been a thorn in the HOA's side for decades. I was simply picking up the torch, but I was tired of playing defense. It was time for a strategic offensive. Later that afternoon, I met with my old friend Sarah, a real estate attorney with a wicked sense of humor and a deep disdain for petty tyranny. I laid it all out for her over beers at a quiet bar far from Hesperides Grove. She listened, her eyes twinkling. So, she summarized, Beverly Higgins is trying to force you to fill in your pond because it offends her aesthetic sensibilities. Correct, I said. And you want to what, exactly? Buy her house. Not exactly, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. I just want a piece of it. I explained the plan that had been forming in my mind since Beverly's last tirade about my unsightly bird feeder. Sarah leaned back, letting out a low whistle. Leo, that is diabolical. It's beautiful, but it's a long shot. It would require a very specific set of circumstances. Let's just say, I replied, I've been doing some homework. The homework involved a guy named Mike, a private investigator I'd hired on a hunch. Beverly and Carl Higgins lived a very flashy lifestyle. Their cars were new, their clothes were expensive, and they took multiple vacations a year. But Carl's business, a commercial printing outfit, had been hit hard by the digital revolution. Mike's initial report suggested the Higgins were living on a mountain of credit. A few weeks and a few discreet inquiries later, my hunch was confirmed. The Higgins weren't just in debt, they were dangerously overleveraged. Their mortgage had been refinanced twice, and they had a significant second lien on the property with a private lender, a man known for his aggressive collection tactics. This was my opening. I couldn't afford to buy Beverly's house outright, not in this market. But I could afford to buy the second mortgage. It was a risky investment. If the Higgins defaulted, I would be second in line to get paid, behind the primary mortgage holder. But I wasn't doing it for the investment. I was doing it for the leverage. With Sarah's help, I made an offer to the private lender. He was surprised to get an offer for the full amount of a note, but he wasn't sentimental. A week later, I was the proud owner of a $60,000 debt secured by Beverly Higgins's home. I held the keys to her financial panic room, and she had no idea. The official notice arrived in a thick, legal-sized envelope. I was now the lien holder. The next step was the delicate part. I couldn't just foreclose. That would be a messy, lengthy process. I needed to provoke a default, but in a way that seemed like I was being perfectly reasonable. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A month after I acquired the lien, I received a notice from the HOA about my pond. It was a final warning, threatening a $500 a day fine until it was removed. I smiled. It was time to raise the stakes. I drafted a letter of my own, on my new, official-looking letterhead from L&G Holdings, the name of the shell company Sarah had helped me create. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Higgins, the letter began. We have recently acquired the second mortgage on your property at 112 Hesperides Grove. As part of our standard risk assessment, we have become aware of a significant devaluation event impacting the collateral for your loan. Specifically, the property adjacent to yours, 108 Hesperides Grove, is the subject of ongoing litigation with the HOA regarding an unapproved water feature. The potential for daily fines and a decline in the neighborhood's perceived value has led us to reassess the risk profile of your loan. Effective immediately, we are requiring an escrow payment to be held against potential loss of value, increasing your monthly payment by $750. I signed it with a flourish. Regards, Leo Giovanni. It was a masterpiece. I was using her own HOA complaint as the weapon against her. The poetic justice was exquisite. I dropped the letter in the mailbox and waited for the storm to hit. I didn't have to wait long. The phone rang an hour later. It was Beverly. Her voice was shrill, but this time it was laced with something new, something raw and beautiful. Panic. Beverly's voice on the phone was a tremor of disbelief and fury. Leo, what is this? What is L&G Holdings? What are you trying to pull? I kept my tone neutral, almost bored. I'm not pulling anything, Beverly. It's a standard business practice. When a property's value is threatened, the lender has a fiduciary responsibility to protect their investment. But you're the one threatening the value, she shrieked. With your pond. My pond is a landscaping feature, I said calmly. Your HOA's fines are the threat. I'm just responding to the market conditions you helped create. There was a sputtering silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding to a halt in her brain. This was a logic trap she couldn't escape. If she admitted the pond wasn't a threat to property values, her entire case against me collapsed. If she insisted it was, she was justifying my actions as her lender. I'm calling my lawyer, she finally hissed. You'll be hearing from him. You do that, Beverly, I said pleasantly. Have him review the loan documents. It's all perfectly legal. I hung up, a sense of profound satisfaction washing over me. The first move was complete. The chessboard was set. True to her word, Beverly's lawyer, a man named Fitzgerald with a voice like gravel in expensive suits, called Sarah the next day. Sarah patched me into the call. Mr. Giovanni, Fitzgerald began, his tone dripping with condescension. This little stunt is transparent harassment. You are using a financial instrument to retaliate against a private citizen for exercising her rights within her homeowners association. Sarah, cool as a cucumber, responded before I could. Our client is exercising his rights as a secured creditor counselor. The HOA's actions, driven in no small part by your client, have created a measurable financial risk. We have every right to mitigate that risk. This is absurd, Fitzgerald scoffed. There's no evidence of any devaluation. We'd be happy to depose your client and the entire HOA board to establish the motive behind the fines, Sarah countered smoothly. We can subpoena all HOA communications regarding Mr. Giovanni's property. I'm sure a judge would be very interested." There was a long pause. Fitzgerald was a bully, and bullies don't like it when you punch back. He changed tactics. "My client is prepared to settle this amicably. She will drop the HOA fines if you drop this escrow requirement." I shook my head at Sarah, even though she couldn't see me. That wasn't the deal. That was a return to the status quo. Sarah understood. "I'm afraid that's not sufficient," she said. "The risk remains as long as the HOA retains the power to levy fines arbitrarily. Our client's investment requires a more permanent solution." The negotiations stretched over 2 weeks. It was a war of attrition fought via email and terse phone calls. Beverly, through Fitzgerald, offered to make the pond a grandfathered an exception. We refused. She offered to resign from the HOA board. We refused. We were playing for keeps. Finally, we arrived at the stalemate we needed. Fitzgerald presented their final, exasperated offer. "My client cannot sustain this increased payment," he admitted, the fight gone from his voice. "She is willing to discuss a deed in lieu of foreclosure to settle the debt." This was it, the moment of truth. A deed in lieu meant the Higgins would sign the house over to me to avoid the messiness of a foreclosure auction. But I didn't want their whole house. That would be too obvious, too messy, and frankly, too expensive, as I'd have to pay off the primary mortgage. "No, counselor," I said, speaking for the first time on the call. "I have a different proposal. I don't want the whole property. I'm prepared to forgive the entire $60,000 debt in exchange for a parcel of land." "A what?" Fitzgerald sounded confused. "A strip of land," I clarified. "A 10-foot wide easement running the entire length of my property line that borders the Higgins' backyard. I want her to subdivide and deed me that specific piece." The silence on the phone was absolute. I could picture the confusion on Fitzgerald's face and the sheer, unadulterated horror dawning on Beverly's as he explained it to her. "Why on earth would you want that?" he finally asked. "For a fence," I said simply. "I believe in clear boundaries." The paperwork was complex, involving surveyors, title companies, and a small mountain of legal documents. Beverly signed under duress, her signature a frantic scrawl. She had no choice. Defaulting would mean losing everything to the bank. This way, she got to keep her house, minus a 10-foot strip of her precious backyard. The day the deed was recorded, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. I went to the county clerk's office myself to get a certified copy. I held the paper in my hands, the ink still smelling faintly of bureaucracy and victory. That evening, I sat by my pond, a cold beer in hand, and watched the fireflies dance over the water. The frogs croaked a cheerful chorus. It was peaceful, but it was the calm before the storm. The real fun was about to begin. The next morning, I called a fencing company. Not just any fencing company. I called the most industrial, no-nonsense crew I could find. I didn't want a cute white picket fence. I wanted a statement. I met the foreman, a burly man named Dave, at the property line. "So, you want a fence right here," he said, pointing to the newly surveyed stakes. "Yep," I said. "What kind of fence are we thinking?" "Chain link. Wood." I smiled. "I want a 6-foot-high, black, vinyl-coated, steel mesh fence, with a locked gate, and I want it built exactly on this property line." Dave shrugged. "You're the boss. When do you want us to start?" "Tomorrow," I said. "The sooner, the better." The construction began at 7 the next morning. The sound of the post-hole digger was like a jackhammer shattering the suburban silence. I was there with a fresh pot of coffee for Dave and his crew. It didn't take long for the commotion to draw attention. Carl Higgins came out first, still in his robe, his face pale. "Leo, what in God's name is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Just installing a fence, Carl," I said cheerfully. "Establishing some clear boundaries." "You can't do this." He spluttered. "This is our yard." "Actually, Carl," I said, reaching into my back pocket. I pulled out the certified copy of the deed. "According to this 10-foot strip is now my yard. I'd be happy to show you the survey." He stared at the document, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then Beverly appeared. She must have seen everything from the window. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She just stood there, her face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred as she watched the steel posts being sunk into the ground, right through the middle of her prized rose garden. She watched as the unrolling mesh fence bisected her perfectly manicured lawn, creating a stark, black scar across her domain. She looked from the fence, to me and back to the fence. Her eyes widened as the full implication dawned on her. This wasn't just a barrier. It was a monument to her defeat, a permanent reminder of her overreach, and it was going to be the first thing she saw every time she looked out her kitchen window. She turned without a word and walked back inside, her shoulders slumped. The pterodactyl had been grounded. For now, the pond was safe. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me even in the morning sun, that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of the war of Hesperides Grove. The silence from the Higgins house over the next week was more unnerving than any of Beverly's previous screeching. It was a heavy, pregnant quiet, thick with the promise of a storm gathering its strength. My black fence stood complete, a stark, modern monolith cutting through the suburban pastiche of Hesperides Grove. It was a thing of brutalist beauty, in my opinion. The vinyl coating gleamed in the sun, and the locked gate emitted a satisfyingly solid clang when I shut it. My pond, now securely on my side of this new divide, seemed to sparkle a little brighter, the frogs croaking with a newfound sense of security. I went about my days tending my garden and watching the ducks, but a part of me was always listening, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on a Thursday, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't Beverly who arrived at my door, but her husband, Carl. He looked diminished, older than he had just days before. The bluster was gone, replaced by a weary desperation. "Leo," he began, his voice soft, almost pleading. "Can we talk? Man to man?" I was wary, but curiosity got the better of me. I invited him in, offering him a seat on the porch overlooking the pond. He didn't look at the water. He just stared at his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. "Beverly, she's not well, Leo," he said, his voice cracking. "This fence, it's broken her. She doesn't sleep. She just sits in the kitchen, staring at it." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I know she's been difficult, but this is cruel." I felt a small, uncomfortable pang of something that felt suspiciously like guilt, but I quickly squashed it. This was a tactic, a sympathy play. "I built a fence on my own property, Carl," I said, keeping my voice even. "A property I acquired legally to settle a debt your wife's actions forced me to acquire. I'm just protecting my investment." "It's not just a fence, Leo," he whispered. "It's a humiliation. Every time her friends come over." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I'll make you a deal. You take down the fence. I'll resign from the HOA board. We'll get the covenants changed. The pond can stay. No more fines. No more harassment. Just take it down." For a moment, I considered it. The peace. An end to the conflict. But looking at Carl's defeated posture, I realized something crucial. This wasn't his offer. This was Beverly's, delivered by her weakened husband because she was too proud to ask herself. If I agreed, she would never learn the lesson. She would just see it as a victory achieved through emotional manipulation. The harassment might stop for a year, maybe 2, but the fundamental imbalance of power, her belief that she could dictate how everyone else lived, would remain. "I'm sorry, Carl," I said, and I found that I genuinely meant it, for him at least. But a deal made under duress isn't a deal. It's a surrender. The fence stays. He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing less. He stood up, looking frail. "She's not going to stop, you know," he said, his voice barely audible. "This is just the beginning for her now. It's a war." And then he shuffled back down my driveway, a ghost in his own life. True to Carl's prediction, the bureaucratic offensive began within days. It was no longer about the pond. The HOA, now led by a newly emboldened and even more vindictive Beverly, found a new arsenal of violations. My grass was a 1/4 inch too long. The paint on my mailbox was allegedly faded. I had an unauthorized garden gnome, a cheerful fellow with a fishing rod eyed, placed by the pond. Each citation came with a fine, each fine with a threat of lien. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Sarah and I spent hours on the phone, batting these frivolities away. It was a drain on my time and resources, but I refused to back down. Then they went after my friends. My buddy Mark, who came over every Sunday to help me with yard work, had his truck parked on the street for 20 minutes too long. He received a hefty fine from the HOA, sent to his home address across town. It was a clear message. Anyone associated with me was a target. The neighborhood, once merely indifferent, became cold. People I'd waved to for years now averted their eyes. Beverly was successfully isolating me, turning me into the neighborhood pariah. The stakes were raised significantly when a man in a cheap suit appeared at my door, identifying himself as a code enforcement officer from the county. He had received an anonymous complaint, he said, regarding a potentially unpermitted water feature constituting a drowning hazard and a zoning violation. He needed to inspect the pond. My blood ran cold. This was no longer an HOA matter, this was the government. Beverly had escalated to a nuclear option. I had to let him in. The man, Officer Dalton, was polite but thorough. He took measurements, photographs, and notes. I had built the pond to code, but the permitting process had been informal, a handshake agreement with a guy from the county who'd since retired. A week later, I received an official notice. The pond was deemed a non-conforming structure due to a lack of proper permits. I was ordered to either bring it up to current code, a process involving expensive engineering surveys and upgrades that would cost tens of thousands of dollars, or fill it in. This was a potentially fatal blow. I was in a state of near panic when I met Sarah at her office. She read the notice, her face grim. "This is serious, Leo," she said. "They can force you to do this. We can appeal, but it's an uphill battle. And it's going to be expensive." I felt the walls closing in. Beverly had found a way to attack me that my clever financial maneuver with the fence couldn't stop. She was using the full weight of municipal bureaucracy to crush me. I was staring into the abyss, considering the very real possibility that I would lose my pond after all. Just as despair was about to consume me, my phone buzzed. It was Mike, the private investigator. "Hey, Leo. Hope you're sitting down," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "You remember I kept a passive eye on the Higgins' financials, just in case? Well, you're not going to believe this. Carl Higgins just took out a new loan. A big one. A second mortgage." I asked, confused. "No," Mike said. "Not a mortgage. A high-interest personal loan from a less-than-reputable online lender. For $50,000. What on earth would they need that for?" I wondered aloud. "That's the thing," Mike replied. "The money hit their account this morning. And this afternoon, a cashier's check for the exact same amount was made out to a company called Municipal Permitting Solutions, LLC. I did some digging. It's a shell company. A very new one. And guess who its sole director is? Officer Dalton's brother-in-law." The shift in the room was palpable. Sarah's eyes widened as she listened to my side of the conversation. When I hung up, I relayed Mike's information. The despair vanished, replaced by a cold, focused fury. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was corruption. Beverly hadn't just filed a complaint, she had bribed a county official to target me. Sarah leaned forward, a predatory smile on her face. "Leo," she said slowly, "this changes everything. This isn't about a pond or a fence anymore. This is a felony. Bribery of a public official. We have them. We have them cold." The plan that formed in my mind then was no longer about defense or even strategic offense. It was about total victory. We couldn't just expose this. We had to do it in a way that maximized the poetic justice. We needed proof, undeniable evidence of a transaction. Mike would get it. He was already on it, tracing the digital paper trail. We had the bank records, the company registration, the connection. Now we needed the final piece, something that tied Beverly directly to the payment. We decided to lay a trap. A carefully worded, seemingly desperate email from me to Beverly, pleading with her to call off the code enforcement action, mentioning the specific cost and the hardship it was causing. We baited the hook with my own apparent defeat. We sent it and waited, watching her inbox like hawks. Her response would be our final, glorious piece of evidence. The war was far from over, but for the first time, I could see the path to its end, and it was beautiful.